Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, tonight is the night we are going to talk about cool and warm season forages. This is the last night of the Master Haymaker program. Uh, Definitely, um, we missed this one back when the ice storm hit. So Dr. Ray Smith was kind enough to rework his schedule so we could meet on one of the prettiest days of the year. So I planned that out perfect, Doc. But I'm going to turn it over to you. He's one of the best forage specialists in the country, and we are blessed to have him at the University of Kentucky. So, Doc, it is all you, my friend, and we are going to talk about our warm and cool season forages. And I can see your slides. However, they are not in presentation mode. Now I got you in presentation mode, and you are muted, my friend.
Okay.
Sounds good. I can hear you and I can see everything now. We're in good shape.
Okay, great. Well, it is a nice evening, and I appreciate you all coming out. I'm sure there's a lot of work that you could be doing. I've saw someone in their tractor, so that's a good multitasking. Good to be here. Like I say, if you all hear something that sounds like a helicopter is about to land, it might be that. I'm at UK right across from the emergency room, and there are helicopters that land there. One just did a minute ago. So bear with me if there's a bit of background noise. So I'm going to jump right in. And as Philip introduced, hay production, cool and warm season forages. I'm going to start off with a little bit of review from some of the past weeks. I won't cover nearly all the cool and warm season forages, but I'll focus on several that I think are very important. And then I look forward to questions that you guys have with anything that I've talked about or anything maybe that I've not talked about or brought up. So first of all, and you've probably seen this a couple of times, this is our forage website, our University of Kentucky forage website. The way I get to this website is I just Google KY forages and it'll pop up. It's always the first thing that pops up. So encourage you to go to this. I'll talk a good bit about variety trials. And so you click there for variety trials. If you want to know A to Z about growing alfalfa, we have a tab for that. If you want to know just about general forage species, we have that information. We've got the YouTube channel I'll mention in just a second. We've got events, so a lot of good resources there. Something I should mention is that if you don't receive our monthly forage news, it's a monthly newsletter. You can see the topics that we had for February. You can go to the website and get to it, or if you click right here where it says click here to subscribe, then it will come to you as an email every month. So Chris probably mentioned the YouTube channel, the Kentucky Forages YouTube channel. I really want to highlight that. You look there at the tabs across the bottom. Those are some of the recent recordings from our Kentucky Alfalfa and Stored Forage Conference. These first few, the farmer producer panels, were excellent. They talked about when the weather doesn't cooperate, what fields do you put a priority on? And we had 3 different farmers, gave excellent perspectives and good answers to questions. There's other talks that were given. I just kind of clicked over to some of the other talks in that alfalfa conference. One of the ones that I really want to highlight to you is this one given by a couple of men from New Holland. And they talked about adjusting hay equipment to minimize field losses. And sure, they had a few pictures of New Holland equipment, but their talk was about any kind of equipment. So excellent presentation to look at what do I need to be thinking about with my hay equipment going forward. So this is just I'm showing you now the YouTube channel. If you Google KY Forages YouTube, this is what you'll see. But if you want to get to a lot of the past presentations, probably the easiest thing is to go here under playlist. And you get something that looks like this. So for example, the Alfalfa and Stored Forage Conference 2021, there were 9 different presentations. You can click there and get to each of those presentations. The next thing on the playlist is the forages at Kentucky Cattlemen Association meeting. I'm back in January. You get the presentations there. So the playlist would give the different meetings that we've had, and that's probably an easier way than trying to scroll through every single recorded presentation. So first, I want to emphasize managing better what you already have. A lot of us, often when I talk, and sometimes when people ask me questions, they're asking, what's the best forage to plant? What's the best thing for hay or the best thing for pasture? But I want to emphasize a few things with what you've already got in the field and how to better manage that. And I know the other speakers have talked about that. So the next few slides will be a review for many of you. First thing is just a reminder. I know Josh McGrath talked to you. When you get your soil test back, then first of all, take a soil test, particularly in hay production every year, because you take a lot of nutrients off the field. When you get it back, then it is important to follow those recommendations. Fertilizer prices are high right now, so you may want to scrimp on your fertilizer. But if you have a report that's anything like this one, that shows the phosphorus high, so you don't need it, potassium very low, you're definitely going to limit your forage production. If you've been using a product like a 1919 on the hay fields, then you have caused large deficiencies in potassium or K. And the reason is in a hay crop, this is from the Southern Forages book. These are the number of pounds of each of these nutrients that are taken off in a ton of hay. So if you've got orchard grass hay, then in 1 ton, you take off 50 pounds of nitrogen, 17 pounds of phosphate, P2O5, 62 pounds of K2O or potash, potassium. You're taking off a lot more potash than you are potassium. A lot more potash than you are phosphorus. So if you're putting 1919 down, then you're over applying and under applying the potassium. Now, if you've got a pure grass, you're going to need to apply nitrogen. If you've got a legume like alfalfa, red clover, then you don't need to apply nitrogen. But my main point, follow the soil test, and remember when you're taking hay off, you're taking off 3 or 4 times as much potash as you are phosphate. And Chris may have talked about this, or one of the other speakers, about the cutting height. I want to emphasize a cutting height ideally should be 3 to 4 inches. So after you cut, you have that much stubble, or you're setting your disc bind or your disc mower at cutting, leaving 3 to 4 inches. This is particularly acute with orchard grass, but it really fits with any grass. And I'll follow up with that in these next few slides. So usually if I'm talking to a group, I ask the question, how many of you have a disc mower? And many do. Then I ask, how close can you cut? And I get all kind of answers, but generally we end up agreeing that a disc mower can cut very close, often maybe too close. Let me show you the things that you can get into if you're not watching your mowing height. So this was a demonstration that we did several years ago. We went into an orchard grass hayfield that was in excellent condition, completely uniform all the way across. And we did different mowing heights and different fertility treatments. So the first strip that you see on your left, it was cut at 4 inches or 4 inches of stubble. And after 3 times that season, we applied 60 pounds of nitrogen, 100 pounds of potassium or phosphate. I'm sorry. K is potassium or potash. I'm sorry that I'm getting things confused, but you see the K listed there. We didn't need to apply phosphorus because it was already at a very high level in this field. So obviously the stand is looking very good. This is a picture taken in mid-October after the last cutting had been 3 weeks before. So there have been 4 cuttings during this season. You see the amount of regrowth. The next strip here, that had been cut at 2 inches. On this particular strip, we'd applied nitrogen, but we hadn't applied the potassium. Okay, then we're showing one here that we had left 2 inches of stubble, applied the full rate of nitrogen, the full rate of potassium. We're talking 180 pounds of nitrogen, 300 pounds of potassium. So a very high level. We still were getting some stand thinning by that lower cutting height. But on the next frame there to your right, we were cutting as close as we could. We were cutting down less than an inch tall, about a half inch tall. And in that one season of cutting like this, we had virtually wiped out that stand. Even this treatment that had the high levels of nitrogen and the high levels of potassium. So here again is that stand that we just about wiped out. The one on the right, we had left 4 inches of stubble. That one had not been fertilized all season long. Leaving that stubble allowed a deeper root system, allowed there to be decent regrowth, even though it was a little bit pale from the lack of fertilizer, but it had recovered much better than here we were scalping, even when we were applying the high rates. So simply put, when we were cutting down close, we had 30 to almost 50% weeds. This is taken late in the fall of that year. 2-inch stubble height, 10 to 20% weeds. The 4-inch stubble height, 5 to 10% weeds. The stand itself, where we had been scalping that season, we were down to less than the 20% stand or less. The 2-inch cutting height, the stand had been dropped to about 40%. Where we had the 4-inch stubble height, we had 90 to 100% stands. And many of you may think to yourself, well, if I cut it at 4 inches, I'm actually leaving some forage out there. I'd rather have that forage in the bales and be feeding it to cattle. And yeah, that's true, particularly maybe the first cutting. You get more if you cut closer, but the fact that it's coming back much slower, the stand is thinning, more weeds are coming in there, eventually catches up with you. And so that 3 to 4-inch stubble height with grasses can do a tremendous advantage in maintaining the stand. With tall fescue, we wouldn't get as quick a response here with a lower cutting height because it can handle a lower cutting height. But in other tests that we've done, you do a couple of years of close cutting, you can make a difference or a detriment in a tall fescue stand as well. Okay, let me remind you a couple of things that Dr. Henning talked about with establishment. These are the recommended seeding depths, the long and the short. In all of our perennial cool season forages, we're talking about 1/4 to 1/2 inch depth. If you're tilling a field, you can get that kind of depth using a cultipacker or a brilliant seeder like this, making sure that you've got a good, fine, firm seed bed, and then using that cultipacker seeder. You can do that in a no-till situation with a no-till seeder. Again, making sure that you're very shallow with your seeding depth. Checking that equipment, checking the depth, maybe even rechecking the depth. Just because the person that used it before you says that the depth is perfect, if the soil is a little more moisture in the soil at your farm, then you could be going down 1/2 to 1 inch deep rather than the 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. And let me just give you an example of this. Here's where we planted alfalfa. At the depths were on top of the ground, 0, 1/4, 1/2, 1, 2, and 3 inches deep. This is 6 days after planting. So it's obvious that the 1/4 and 1/2 inch, we've got good stands. We're not seeing many seedlings at the deeper depths. Now you might say, well, this is only 6 days. It's going to take longer to come up from a deeper depth. But even at 12 days, the seed that had been planted that 1 inch deep and deeper, in essence, all the energy had been used up from that seed trying to get the little seedling to the surface, and it had just expired before it ever got to the surface. Once it gets to the surface, it can grow, take up sunlight. Photosynthesis allows it to keep growing. And now I'm going to talk about forage species. So there's a whole lot of forage species that we can plant in Kentucky. Here's just not even a complete list. And I'm not going to try to go through, or definitely not going to go through all of these. I'm only going to pick out a few. But there are a tremendous number of forage species adapted in our state. So if you want to know a lot more about forage species, this publication, again, get it on our website, Google KY Forages, look under the forage species tab. AGR 175 is the name. You could look it up under that, or just forage identification. If you look University of Kentucky, forage identification, Google that, you're going to get up this publication. The real nice thing about this publication is we've worked hard to go through and take the main perennial forages that can be planted in Kentucky, not the ones that are kind of oddities that would only be used a little bit, and put them in this publication. Now I'm going to highlight one that several of you in your region of Kentucky have asked me about is smooth brome grass. Not planted a whole lot, but this publication is a way to find out a bit more information about species, whether it's brome grass that not much is planted or whether it's something like orchard grass. And this highlights several things with smooth brome grass. Excellent production, particularly a first cut, excellent yield. The biggest disadvantage is it's quite slow to get started. But many of you might have this in some older fields. I often see it in fence lines because smooth brome grass, I say I see it in fence lines because smooth brome grass is very sensitive to close cutting or frequent cutting. So in a fence row that's not cut at all, it's still there. So I'm not promoting this. I'm just saying this is a good way to use this publication. And it even has some forages that aren't used as much. You can get that more information. Okay, another publication, and Philip may have emailed this to you, but it's our updated version of the Grain, Forage, and Crop Cover Guide for Kentucky. And so it's got listed all of the forages, all of the crops that we can grow in Kentucky. You look at these examples I've got here, something like German or foxtail millet, Japanese millet. These are in alphabetical order, so I just picked a few. Oats, I'll talk a little bit later about planting spring oats. It talks about if you want to plant them for grain, if you want to plant them for hay or silage, if you want to plant as a cover crop. It gives the seeding rate, gives the time of the year to seed. It gives how deep to plant them. So just a lot of good information in this publication that we refer to sometimes just as AGR 18, but it's the Grain, Forage, and Cover Crop Guide for Kentucky. This is the second half of that same information. So here's the oats. As I said, it not only gives the planting information, but the timing. It gives the relative production. It also gives a bit more information on each of these. So here's some information on spring oats. Here's some information on orchard grass. On our forage website, you click on that forage variety trials, you're going to see a list like this. Here's the list for 2020. So in essence, this is up-to-date information all the way through last growing season. One of the most useful of the publications, you'll notice going back to this whole list, there's a whole lot of different reports. If you only want to pick up one report, then get your county office to print it off, download it, but it would be this long-term summary. Like I say, your county office can give it to you in a paper format. You can download it from the Forage website. It allows you to look at all of these different forages and the yield information, but not just what's been in the ground the last 2 or 3 years, which the individual reports show you. It's going to show you accumulated averages of yield over the last 15 years. So a tremendous amount of information. And I'll give you some examples as we move through this presentation. I'm going to start with tall fescue. Now, many of you have that in fields already. It's not uncommon that people say, well, fescue is not the best thing for hay, so I want to plant something that's a higher value for hay. I'm going to plant orchard grass. And you're right, if you're selling hay, then you're probably going to get a better market for orchard grass hay than you are for tall fescue. But if you're feeding your own animals, the quality between tall fescue cut at the right stage and orchard grass cut at the right stage is very similar. So particularly if you've got ground that maybe it's a bit waterlogged, orchard grass won't grow, then fescue would be a good option to plant. Or you want something that's going to survive longer than orchard grass, than tall fescue. But I'm going to mention some specific varieties that I want to, if you're planting it, I want to encourage you to plant. So you can plant Kentucky 31. Several people have asked me recently, I can get that seed cheaper. I know it survives well. Why don't I just plant that? Many of you know the story with Kentucky 31 tall fescue. It does have an endophyte in the plant. This picture is showing the little fungal strands growing inside the plant. They help the plant survive, but they produce toxins that can be detrimental to animals. So the fungus grows not only in the base of the plant, but all the way up into the seed. So the advantages of fescue I mean, I think we all know the advantage is it's persistent, long growing season, tolerates abuse, good for fall and winter grazing. The disadvantages are, the main disadvantage is that endophyte, producing toxins, or ergovaline is the main toxin, causing issues with animals in grazing, but also can be issues in hay because that toxin is still present in the hay, even though it has reduced in concentration during the haymaking process. So my main point to you is to think about the novel endophyte tall fescues if you are planting tall fescue. Okay, so what I mean when I say a novel endophyte, going back about 20, actually close to 25 years ago, New Zealand researchers discovered endophytes, tall fescue endophytes that did not produce ergovaline, but they still helped the plant survive. So one of these endophytes, in fact, the first one that was patented under the name of Max Q. And so then that Max Q endophyte, that novel endophyte, or we might call it a beneficial endophyte, has been put in different varieties. And many companies have now released novel endophyte varieties. And the whole point of that, of a novel endophyte variety, is you've got better average daily gain. Here's the example of the Max Q endophyte with better autumn and spring production on stalkers. A fungus-free fescue or endophyte-free fescue has similar very good gains. It's just the stand life is going to be more like orchard grass, more like kind of 4-year average stand life. Whereas the Kentucky 31 toxic fescue, lower gains. Not just do you get better gains with the novel endophyte, but you also get better persistence because that fungus-free fescue is going to go out of a stand, as I mentioned, in a period of say 4 years on average. So there's a lot of the novel endophyte fescues available. And the seed cost is higher than Kentucky 31. It is higher than the endophyte free, but you've got the advantage of not having the toxins, but getting the better survival. Now notice every one of these varieties, it has a first name like Bar Optima or Jessup or Lacefield. That's the first name is the name of the actual fescue variety. The second name is the name of that beneficial or novel endophyte. So the variety Lacefield that's recently been released, the novel endophyte is called Max Q2. The Bar Optima is called Plus E34 is the name of the endophyte. So if you have those two names, you know that you've got that combination of that fescue variety plus that endophyte. Now, if you don't have information that it's a novel endophyte variety, for example, there's a variety called Kentucky 32. That variety is an endophyte-free variety. They kind of decided that everyone knew Kentucky 31, so that they would develop a new variety called Kentucky 32. It's just an average endophyte-free variety. It doesn't survive as well as Kentucky 31 because it's endophyte-free. It doesn't survive as well as the novel endophyte varieties because it doesn't have an endophyte in it. So you can go to our 2020 tall fescue and brome grass report and get a lot more detailed information about yield. And I mentioned you go to that summary report to just kind of get accumulated information over the last 15 years. Now, if any of you want something to do on a rainy day on Thursday, we actually have a whole workshop. We're going to have this in person with masks and things, but it will be in person down at the stockyards. So you go to our Forage website, click on events, and register for this meeting. We'll have speakers from a number of states coming in for this. So if you plan last minute, then make sure you registered for this by the end of the day tomorrow. That's when registration will close. Okay, so I started with fescue because we know it survives well here. There are improved varieties. If you've got Kentucky 31 in the field, that's fine. It's fine to cut for hay. The big limitation is you still are going to have some of that that toxin, that ergovaline in the hay when you're feeding it. So that can reduce or can cause some animal issues. So the novel endophyte are the way you get around that. But adding clover, adding red clover that I'll mention in a minute is a great way in a hay field to plant with Kentucky 31 fescue to reduce a lot of those toxicity issues. So now I'm moving on to orchard grass. And many people that are growing cash hay They want orchard grass. They know that in many markets, particularly in the equine markets, orchard grass is a high value hay. So an advantage of orchard grass: establishes well, good yields, good demand for hay. It's a good match with alfalfa with maturity, meaning that about the time the orchard grass seed head is there, the alfalfa is at a late bud, early bloom stage. I'm ready for harvest. Disadvantage is stand life mainly, and a pure stand of orchard grass can get a bit clumpy over time. So remember what I talked about earlier in the presentation, that particularly with orchard grass, the cutting height, getting up there 3 to 4 inches, makes a tremendous difference in maintaining that stand. Now, here's something from a publication, and it's actually a publication for persist orchard grass, which is a good variety. I don't want to put it down, but I just want to point out a thing for you to kind of watch closely when you're looking at information on varieties, published information that the companies put out. So this is University of Kentucky yield data in 2004. Persist did well. Persist did better than all of the other varieties. And like I say, Persist is a variety I recommend, but I recommend several other ones. It's not always the top variety, but the company made sure that they found tests that it was the top variety. So I encourage you to go to our variety test report. Don't just look at 1 year, look at several years of information, or look at those summary tables and look at how it's done. Any of these varieties have done over time. Don't just take one report or one just table and base all your buying decisions on that. So here's a screen capture of the 2020 orchard grass report. Now I want to highlight a couple of things. So we've talked about yield. I mean, we all know that we want high yield, and that's the main thing that we test for. But we also test for maturity. When that orchard grass variety is going to go to head. We do the same thing with fescue and all of the cool season grasses. There's a small table here in the front page from some work we did a few years ago. But let me highlight what we have in every one of the reports, every one of the tests. Gene Olson is our variety test coordinator. Gene here on the tractor doing some planting. Gene actually runs one of the largest variety testing programs in the country here at University of Kentucky. So Gene gives a lot of added information besides just cutting and weighing and getting the yield. He goes into the plots every spring and rates for maturity. And so at the time that he's about to cut it, he looks at it and he has this pretty complicated scale. The point is that the lower numbers, when he cuts, the lower number means that it's less mature. So 45 would be that it's at a boot stage. The seed head hasn't come out yet. 50 would mean it's the beginning of the seed head emergence. The seed head just coming out. You get up to 58 and 60, you get up into a full seed head and pollen coming out. So if your goal was to sell orchard grass at a stage that has a lot of leaves and not a big seed head, then you'd want a later maturing variety, would give you better options. You can cut it a little bit later in the season. You get out of some of the issues with the wet weather in the spring. But most people plant later maturing orchard grasses because they're planting orchard grass with alfalfa. And sometimes a variety like Prairie or Benchmark or even Persist are early maturing. And so they can have a full seed head before the alfalfa is ready to cut. So you look in our report. This is a small version. Let me show up a blow up version of that same table. So this is in the 2020 report. And the beginning of the table kind of blown up. You've got the varieties listed here. You've got how vigorous they were as seedlings, how quickly they came up. And then you've got the maturity. So you notice here, planted in fall of 2017. In 2018, when it was harvested May 8th, we had varieties like Treposno and Lyra and Berta that they were still at a boot stage when these other varieties already had the seed head coming out. You go to the next year, these varieties were a little bit further along, but still these last 4 weren't as mature. You go to the 2020 year and notice that these 4 late maturing varieties, they were still at a vegetative or leafy stage. They hadn't even put up their seed head, or their stem hadn't even elongated. There wasn't even at the boot stage when these others were already past the boot stage. So the next tape, this is just a summary. And if you say, I want to get a late maturing variety, then take your phone out and take a picture of this screen. Or obviously you can go back and listen to the presentation. But I looked at all of the data over the last about 6 years from our variety reports. And these are the late maturing varieties. Now the numbers on the right show the yield comparison. So 100% would be average yield. And so above 100 means above average. And some of the late maturing varieties, like the Berta, is way below average with yield. So that's probably not one you'd choose. But the Harvestar is average for yield, and we've got 6 different tests it's been in. The Alpine 2 is 106% of average. So that's a good one. It's only been in 2 tests. It'd be nice if it had been in more tests, but that gives you a feel for the kind of information you can get if you want a late maturing orchard grass. Hey, Timothy, another crop that we don't grow a lot of in Kentucky because it's only about a 2-year stand life. But if you're in the cash hay market, then Timothy can have a lot of value, particularly if you're selling to horse owners. They often like Timothy. And so let me tell you how you go about deciding what Timothy to plant. So advantages of Timothy, you've got a large first cutting yield. Timothy tends to mature later, or does mature later, than orchard grass and tall fescue. So it's a little later in the growing season. You're getting often into early June, or at least late May. So you get a little better windows for cutting. High demand for hay, good nutritive quality, particularly before the seed head has come out. But check what your buyers want, because there's a number of people buying hay for horses that actually want a seed head, both to prove to them it's Timothy, but also they've got maybe just maintenance type horses, or horses they're riding and not putting that much demand on. And they don't care as much for the leafy stage. They just want some decent quality. Disadvantages, I've already said, a short stand life, lower quality when it's cut really late. One of the biggest disadvantages besides the stand life is it has very little regrowth after the first cutting. But if you say, I want to plant something that I can sell into a cash hay market, and I want a good bumper crop that first cutting, then Timothy could be an option. But remember, 2-year stand life, you're going to be planting it or replanting it every couple of years. So we've got a Timothy and Kentucky bluegrass report. You can go into this individual report and look at the maturity of Timothy if you want one that matures earlier, matures later. I'm obviously going here and look at the yield as well. Okay, I want to move into, so I've talked about those 3 grasses. Tall fescue, manage what you have, or you could plant a novel endophyte variety for improved quality and still good survival. You could plant orchard grass, a good cash hay. You could plant Timothy, if you're okay with that short term, if you've got that market for it. I'm going to move into a couple legumes, red clover and alfalfa. Now, rarely in Kentucky do we plant red clover as a hay field in a pure stand. But red clover it's easy to add it into a fescue stand. It's easy to frost seed it or to drill it in. It's got a vigorous seedling, so it comes up a lot quicker inside planting it into an existing stand of grasses than alfalfa does. A lot of advantages of red clover, particularly in mixing with fescue, because the red clover has a unique ability to reduce the toxic levels of tall fescue. The limitation with red clover is it only lives 2 to 3 years. So the improved varieties typically will be in there 3 years. The cheaper seed is more like 1.5 years. Here's Dr. Henning as a younger man. And here is common red clover, just red clover bought with no name on it, are not a variety name. It may have some kind of brand name, but it thins out quickly versus the certified seed. So buying certified seed makes a big difference. You go to the red and white clover report, you're going to see the yield information. You're going to see a table like this. This is planted in 2018. This is in that 2020 red and white clover report. I know the numbers are small, but I want to make 2 points, and I'll let you look at this on your own. First of all, you go to the far right-hand column, you can see the yield between these. This is the 3-year total. But I mentioned to you that red clover is like the common red clover, meaning that you don't know the variety, but the seed's typically pretty cheap. It's typically just, the bag would say medium red clover. It did fine the first year, planted in May of 18. Good survival there, the end of 18. Good survival that first cutting of 19, and then it just fell apart. So you weren't getting a second or third cutting. You weren't getting any cuttings in 2020. The improved varieties, like the Freedom, the Kinlan, the newer variety here, SS0303 from Southern States, they had good survival that first year, good survival the second year, decent that following spring. Most of those have started to drop off by August. So you look at survival. But what I encourage most of you to do is either the last page of the red clover individual report, or go to this long-term summary report. Red clover, the red clover yield is table 2, page 3. Here is the big table with the red clovers that we've planted in Kentucky over the years. Now, hard to read all of this information, so let me just give a quick close-up of what you're looking at. So here's a close-up of some of the varieties, and then the yield. And I've just got a little bit of the yields because we've had a lot more tests than just these few columns here. But I encourage, because if you look here, there's a whole lot of columns. Every column represents a different test. Bunch of tests in Lexington, but several in Princeton and Quicksand, and even some ones that we had in Eden Shell a few years ago. But what I encourage you to do, when you look at this summary table at the back of the red clover report, or it's the same summary table, 8%, and that's Kinlan certified seed. And you want to make sure if you do buy Kinlan, that's an older variety out of University of Kentucky, that it's certified, because Kinlan that maybe have that has that name on the bag, but it's uncertified, doesn't have a blue tag. When we've planted that, our average yield is 70% of average. So that's not what you'd plant. So there's a number of varieties here that are above 100%. Those would be the ones to choose. Those would be the ones to plant. Those would be the ones to interseed into that existing fescue stand to improve the quality, improve the yield, to reduce the nitrogen because you've got that free nitrogen fixation. It's not too late to plant red clover if you're able to get a no-till drill. It is too late to frost seed it. We're not going to have much frost anymore, but not too late to drill it into a stand. Okay, now let me talk about alfalfa. Obviously a premium crop. We don't plant a whole lot of it in northern and northeastern Kentucky, but I know a number of you have fields that you can grow alfalfa on. First thing before I go into a couple of the traits is it's essential if you're going to plant alfalfa that you've got well-drained soil. Fescue can handle waterlogged soils, but alfalfa cannot. And there's no variety that will survive well in waterlogged soils. So you need good drainage. You need a pH above 6.5. You need to already have the fertility, the phosphorus and potassium at a good level. Don't bother planting it if the pH is at 5.8. Get the pH up before you plant alfalfa. Make sure that you've got good disease resistance. And a good example, in Kentucky, we've had a number of stand losses in the last few years from Aphanomyces. That happens at an early stage. So you want to choose a variety that's resistant to Aphanomyces. Some of you may have had issues if you've planted alfalfa with potato leafhopper. There are varieties that you can plant that have good resistance to potato leafhopper, like this variety shown here in comparison to this one that is stunted. The reason that varieties like this can have resistant potato leafhopper is they actually have tiny little almost microscopic hairs on the stems, and those limit the feeding of the leafhopper and the nymph for the adult stage. Roundup Ready is a really good choice if you're planting alfalfa. It's going to cost more, but you've got some nice options with cleaning up the weeds in the field. So this is something we planted it at the UK Spindletop Farm, just north of Lexington. Had some Johnson grass coming into that field. And we actually kind of messed around with our spraying and it got like this. But we came in at this stage of Johnson grass, sprayed with Roundup. This was that same field, the end of that season. So it obviously we know Roundup could do a good job on Johnson grass. And many of you say, well, I want to have a mixture of alfalfa and orchard grass, or alfalfa and some other kind of grass. So why would I plant Roundup Ready? I'm going to kill the grass. But many cash hay producers are using Roundup Ready alfalfa and having it for a year or 2 years, cleaning up the weed issues. And then in the fall, after the last cutting of alfalfa, after a September cutting of alfalfa, then drilling the orchard grass in. And then typically not needing to worry about weeds because they've been cleaned up during those early stages. So you can go to our alfalfa report, the 2020 alfalfa report, get a lot of information on yield, on disease resistance. You can also get this report that comes out through the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance. It's simply at alfalfa.org, or if you Google alfalfa variety ratings, it's going to pop up. And it's going to give you even more detail than our report has with the disease resistance, the insect resistance, in different varieties. Okay, I want to move into a couple of cereals. Then I'm going to talk about some warm season options and make sure that I'm finished with good time for questions. So if you want to plant just annual crops to cut for hay or silage, there's a lot of options. You could plant rye, triticale, wheat, oats. The one that has the highest quality and the highest yields, or let me take that back. The one that has the best combination of quality and yield would be wheat. Triticale gives more yield, but not as good a quality. Rye gives even more yield, but even less quality. So rye would be one more for grazing. Wheat would be more of an annual that you'd plant if you wanted to cut for hay or cut for silage. So advantages, you can use it for pasture, hay, or silage. Very winter hardy. Later sowing than some of the other annual forage crops. I've got a picture that'll come up here in a second with wheat. So this picture is in the spring of the year. We don't have as much growth as we had with the rye, but we can get a nice high quality crop off of wheat, off that annual system. In fact, something that we're doing, we talked about alfalfa a minute ago. Dr. Henning's got a study planned that will start this fall of planting wheat into older stands of alfalfa to get kind of an extra boost to cutting that next spring. The limitation is it'll be pretty competitive to the alfalfa, so that would only be in a late term stand. You know, a number of people have asked me this year, either because of flooding or other issues, they feel like they're going to need more hay than they're going to have in their field, or maybe they've got some of the fields that have been damaged by winter or by floods. What can they plant? So spring oats is the only, in my opinion, the only real option for a spring planted small grain. High yielding, early summer hay. So planted right now, planted mid to end of March, you're going to have in 2 months period of time, 1.5 tons to 2 tons of hay per acre. In several years, we've had an additional cutting of another 1/2 to 3/4 of a ton. So oats maintains the quality better than other cereals when it has a seed head. So kind of that quick crop, that emergency crop, maybe even a crop you plant now, even though you're going to plant summer annuals into that same field, you've got a crop in 2 months. So plant it, drill it into the field, add nitrogen to get that boost of growth. We're typically going about 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen. That would be about 130 pounds of urea. And many people say, what oat variety should I plant? And so we've got a separate publication that is called the Annual Grass Report, Warm Season and Cool Season. And here's an example of the summary table from that report. Or you could just go to that long-term summary publication and look at it. So we're going to look over here on the right-hand side, like I talked about with red clover, and we're going to say, what are varieties that have above average yield? Okay, so here's a variety that's 113% of average. It's been in 6 different trials, so it means it's got a lot of information. It's an older variety called Excel. Jerry spring oats is one that's very common. That's 103% of average. One that's not planted are known as much about are black hulled oats. That was producing very well with the spring planting. That Persic was 112. So there's some varieties you can plant. Some people just go to the feed store and buy spring oats that you feed to a horse. I mean, that'll work, but I'd encourage you to think about an improved variety to get a little bit better yield. But even those feed oats is going to give you some production this spring. Okay, now I want to move into warm seasons, and I'm actually intentionally not spending a lot of time with the warm seasons as far as this talk on hay production, because there's not a lot of good option with warm season annuals. In fact, I'm not mentioning some of the native warm season grasses. Those would be really the only real options if you're planting warm seasons for hay as a perennial crop. When you get into northeastern Kentucky, Bermuda grass is really not a very good option. That would be the other main warm season perennial, but it's not a native to Kentucky. So something like big blue stem is a good combination of quality and yield. But I'm going to let you look up that on your own. I'm not talking much about that tonight, but I'm going to talk about some of the warm season annuals. Okay, here's a picture of sorghum Sudan grass. So I'm going to mention a couple of things with the sorghum species and with pearl millet. Okay, so pearl millet looks like cattails in essence with the seed head like this. So there's nothing else as a summer annual that looks like that with that big long seed head. So that's pearl millet. Beside it is sorghum. Very similar to sweet sorghum. Forage sorghum grows tall, produces a lot of tonnage, but has a big thick stalk. So it's only going to work for silage. It's not going to work for hay. In the middle, you've got sorghum Sudan grass. Still a pretty big stem, though, a little hard for hay. Can work well as silage, chopped silage or round bale silage. The next one is Sudan grass. So the sorghum Sudan is just a cross between these sorghum and Sudan grass. But if you want to plant a warm season annual for hay, then Sudan grass is a good option. Much finer stems than the others, so it can be cut and cured for hay. Be very important to have a mower conditioner to break those stems. Okay, the last one here I'm not talking about very much, but some of you may notice that. Looks like these other sorghums. It's in the sorghum family. It's actually Johnson grass. Now, none of us probably need to plant Johnson grass. We have a lot of it coming up in fields. It's actually illegal to plant because it's a noxious weed. But if you got fields that have been overtaken with Johnson grass, it is, as some of you know, can be a very high quality hay. At least if you cut it when it's still at a leafy stage, not when it's up over your head. If you've got a field that's been taken over with Johnson grass and you just kind of given up on it, you may want to decide to fertilize that field, give it some nitrogen, let it grow to its best yield and potential. It's illegal to plant it, but it's not illegal to harvest Johnson grass. In some areas, you may decide that that's something you're going to do, at least for a period of time. But I'm not spending a lot of time on Johnson grass because I want to talk about things you can buy seed and plant. So if you are going to plant something like sorghum Sudan and cut it for silage, or Sudan grass and cut it for hay, then to get a better quality version, buy a BMR type, a brown midrib type. And the main point of this table is that this is some data that Dr. Chris Teutsch, some work that he did when he was still at Virginia Tech. every year, he had higher quality, higher digestibility from the BMR type sorghum, sorghum Sudan and Sudan grass than just the regular type. So the BMR type, it just means that the midrib of the leaf is more of a brownish color rather than the white color that is in the standard grasses in the sorghum family. And getting a bit short on time, so in fact, I'm going to actually skip this one because the main point here is that you want varieties in a high yield and high digestibility. So it doesn't help you to BMR type if it's low yielding. So Chris has put together this table. And this is from Virginia information, so we feel that it's useful, but we're now taking quality data on all of our summer annual tests that we've got in the field. So we'll be getting more of information from Kentucky. But we've got 3 highlighted. These are in the sorghum Sudan grass group or species. This AS 6501, AS 9301, and the extra grays BMR. All of those varieties had high yield, or above average yield, and above average digestibility in 3 years. Other varieties had that good yield and digestibility, but more haphazard, more just 1 year, or maybe 2 years. So think about that if you're planting something in the sorghum family, whether it's Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan grass. Now we're talking about hay. I've mentioned to you this report, but I didn't show you a picture of it. So here's the annual grass report. Go to the Forage website, click on variety trials, go to this annual grass report to look at the information on everything from these warm season grasses to the oats, even to some of the other cereals. But here's the table of Sudan grass yields. You'll see there's several Sudan grass listed. One that's done very well in Kentucky is 9302. It was in later tests. It's been above average in tests. So you can look at that report. Actually, if I was standing in the room, I would hold up for you this variety test report. But just to show you what I'm talking about, or to speak out loud what I'm talking about, from 2017 in Lexington and in Princeton, the 9302 Sudan grass averaged 113% of average for its yield. Okay, crabgrass. Now, don't go home and tell everybody that I'm encouraging. Don't call up Dr. Green, who talked to you about weed control, and tell him that I told you to plant crabgrass. It is a warm season annual. It is very high quality, and it can have high yield. Now, a lot of the just common type crabgrass that grows up as a weed is not as high yielding as the improved types. The other advantage of crabgrass as far as a summer annual is it doesn't produce prussic acid or cyanide. It also has a lot less potential to accumulate nitrates, though it can still accumulate nitrates at high nitrogen applications. So this is another picture that Dr. Teutsch took when he was at Virginia Tech. 60 days after seeding into a tilled seed bed, this was the yield he got on the Red River crabgrass, so one of the improved varieties. So if you were going to say, I like how good crabgrass grows in the summer, I'm going to plant it for a forage, I'm going to plant it for hay, you'd want an improved variety. If you've already got crabgrass in your fields, and that's my main point in talking about crabgrass, if you've already got it there and it's coming up, then just making sure that you harvest that field, or that field that's mixed maybe with crabgrass and clover and fescue. I'm cutting it when the crabgrass is still at a leafy stage. That's going to be harder later in the season, but earlier in the season, it's a way to get a high quality crop. In fact, if I was there in person, I would give you about 6 hay samples to look at. And there's one hay sample that's about 25% alfalfa and about 75% crabgrass. The grower who gave me that hay sample made me promise that I wouldn't tell who he was. That quality of that crabgrass alfalfa is similar quality to a mature orchard grass alfalfa. Now, not an ideal orchard grass alfalfa, but one that was on the mature side. Quite a high quality hay. So don't write something off just because there's crabgrass there. At the same, don't write it off just because there's Johnson grass. That can be a high quality hay. So in thinking about the warm season annuals, think about how they might fit into your forage system. So I don't really think it makes sense for most people in Kentucky to say, I'm going to plant Sudan grass every year, use that as my summer forage that I'm cutting for hay, because you've got the expense of planting it every year. Some years you're not going to get as much yield as other years. But when you're thinking about, I want to renovate this field, I've got a lot of weeds, I want to start over. Maybe I want to plant the novel and the fight tall fescue. How am I going to get that started? A great way to get it started is to spray out your old field that's full of Kentucky 31 fescue and weeds, spray it with Roundup back in the spring, plant Sudan grass in to get 2 or 3 cuttings over the summer. And that's going to help clean up weeds plus give you forage. And then spray again in August and drill your novel and the fight fescue into that. So think about a system. And in my mind, the best way the summer annuals fit is into a system. Now, I should mention one last thing. When I talked about you could plant crabgrass, the newer types like the Red River or others get a good yield, a good summer crop. We all know that crabgrass can be a weed. So even the improved types do reseed. That can be an advantage if you want it to come up next year, but not an advantage if you're going into other crops. So just remember that. Hey, Philip, I think I'll just finish there, and glad to answer questions. And you said this group has a lot of questions, so I'm ready to hear from people.
All right, question number 1. On the AGR 18, there was Japanese millet mentioned.
Hey.
Can you explain what Japanese millet is?
If I were standing with you in the field, I would bring up my phone and I would Google Japanese millet. But it grows much like a German or foxtail millet. The foxtail millet just has that seed head that looks like yellow foxtail, but a lot bigger. The Japanese millet, it's a one cut type of forage, and it has a seed head that's a broader seed head. It's more planted for wildlife feed because it's producing a lot more seed than the German millet. So the long and short is it's a annual millet that kind of gives you one cutting if you're cutting it for hay, but its more common use is as wildlife feed. Maybe when you want to have a dove shoot, you're going to plant Japanese millet.
Thank you, sir. Hey, guys, just a quick reminder that if you have questions, put them in the chat. When you were talking about the Roundup Ready alfalfa and reseeding orchard grass in it in the fall, will that hurt the crowns of the alfalfa by drilling orchard grass into them?
A really good question. And you would think, well, alfalfa can't make a new root or crown. But I've never seen a stand that was really hurt by drilling in. So you are going to have some crowns that are split, but typically by the time that fall comes along or the next fall after that, the main growing points of the alfalfa are actually down about 1 inch deep, where the new shoots come up from. So about all you're going to do is you're going to kind of chop off some stems, going through there with the drill. So I've not seen a issue with damage that was permanent from drilling it in. Make sure you drill it after a cutting, so you've got just the alfalfa stubble and you've got the orchard grass there coming up. Okay.
Okay. Next question. I limed my field last fall and 3 weeks ago fertilized them. When applying the fertilizer, I had clover spread as well. When should I sow my fescue?
So I'll answer a couple of things. I'm assuming that field already was an existing field and they're just trying to thicken it up. Is that a safe assumption, you think, Philip?
I'm assuming that.
Yeah. So I'll answer it that way, and then I'll answer it another way too. So if you're trying to get the fescue in for spring seeding, then you want to get it in ASAP. You want to make sure it's if at all possible in before the end of March, because fescue is fairly slow getting started. So it's going to have a hard time competing as we get into the warmer weather. So as soon as you can, it could have even been done in the last couple of weeks. Now, if it was a new field, if you're starting over with fescue or fescue and clover, then my recommendation is just to wait to fall, because fescue is going to establish much better with the September seeding. But I wouldn't put the clover at the same time. I would plant the fescue, let it get established, even give it some nitrogen to give a really healthy root system. Maybe I need some herbicides to knock out some weeds, and then put clover in the following spring. So you've been able to take care of weeds. You haven't had the competition from the clover with the new fescue. So hopefully I answered that the two ways that would fit.
Okay. Next one. We have some pastures that were renovated uh, with 31 fescue and white clover, along with winter wheat cover crop. Do you think the fescue and clover will come up once it starts to warm up? This was sowed at the end of October, first part of November.
My honest opinion, with that late getting it in, is there probably won't be a real good catch of the fescue. The wheat got up. Any fescue that germinated, either the winter probably knocked it out, or the competition from the wheat knocked it out. The clover, um, some of it came up and probably winter killed, but there's probably a good bit of it that the seeds just sitting in the soil, and it'll be coming up this spring. Now you could prove me wrong, because if fescue's planted late enough, and the ground is really cool, then sometimes the seed won't germinate. They'll stay there. But that doesn't happen much in Kentucky. It would happen in the northern U.S., where it just stay frozen all winter. But definitely good to get out there and take a look at it. But if it's very thick stand of wheat, then and you're seeing fescue and clover come up underneath, then you want to take that wheat off as soon as you can, soon as it's practical, even though you might not have a big yield, because it'll cause a lot of excessive shading. If you're not seeing much fescue or clover down underneath it, then you may let the wheat go ahead and get up to a good stage and cut that, have a good yield. Maybe you got some fescue and clover underneath, but if you don't, then try to get those in again in the fall in September.
Okay. Now let's see. What is the best? Let's see. Next one. What is the best fertilizer to use on my new grass in the spring? Also, when is the best time to apply the fertilizer?
So if it's just a grass stand and you're thinking of getting that good growth for hay, then nitrogen's important. And in the spring, really the cheapest form of nitrogen is what to use, because urea usually is cheapest. This time of year, urea is not going to volatilize like it does in the summer. So I would use the cheapest nitrogen you can get. Now, applying the phosphorus and potassium, and I mentioned that the potassium or potash, you're taking off 3 times as much as you are the phosphorus. Then on a grass stand, you can really apply that anytime. Apply it to the soil test recommendations. With alfalfa, we're going on such a high rates, we encourage you to apply the potassium in split applications. So the long and the short is nitrogen now the cheapest form if you're doing spring application. With the other nutrients, get those on there as soon as you can, according to the soil test recommendations. Many people will put the potassium and phosphorus on in the fall. Okay, Philip, hopefully
All
answered
right.
that.
Next question. This is another fertilized question. When cutting hay from May through September, do you find that the most bank you get for your buck on spreading fertilizer is before first cutting or after first cutting? Non-alfalfa.
Okay, so grass, clover kind of thing.
Yes, sir.
So with nitrogen, it's at green up. So any nitrogen that you're putting down, and if you got 25 or 30% or higher clover, then generally we don't recommend nitrogen. But if you have less than that, then early spring nitrogen, and I would go ahead and put the other nutrients out then. Now, if your levels of potassium are in the upper end of the medium range or in the high range, then there's going to be a lot of that potassium becomes available over winter, and is available for that first cutting. So if that potassium level, you've already got a pretty good level in the soil and you're just replacing what you take off for hay, then you're going to get better utilization, more efficient utilization by putting on after the first cutting. But if the level is not up there in that upper medium or high range, then I would just put it on first thing in the spring to get that to get the growth. And then phosphorus, it doesn't really matter what time of the year you put phosphorus on. Whatever is most convenient, probably typically when you're putting something else out.
Sounds good. Thank you, sir. All right. And then the next question. Usually, when we talk about corn and beans and stuff like that, we refer to yield as in bushels. What do you mean yield as in forages? I think they're meaning like tonnage.
So we usually in all of our variety reports, and when we talk about yield with forages, we're talking about tons per acre. Now, the only exception to that, and like I say, pretty well any of our reports, we give tons per acre. Now that's dry tons, so that's like tons of hay per acre. Now, when you're looking at some information, maybe from another state, or you're looking at information on corn silage yield, and you see these numbers that say 20 tons per acre. Now that's not dry tons though. They're looking at with corn silage, it's 65% moisture, 35% dry matter. So you've got a lot of water that goes into that 20 tons per acre. So notice, I mean, we on any of our reports, we would have there and we would say it's on a dry matter basis. I don't think it's all on a, it's all dry material. It's all like hay material. Even if it's something like sorghum Sudan grass that we tell you you're going to be best off to cut it for silage or baleage, and we still give it on dry tons per acre.
Okay. Next question. Any recommended dates to drill perennial ryegrass into pastures where cattle have wintered?
Okay, so really good question. And let me give a quick background. So perennial ryegrass, it is perennial in Kentucky. Typically, though, just has about a 2-year survival. But it has the advantage over annual ryegrass. If you plant annual ryegrass in the spring, you're going to lose it by early midsummer. So perennial ryegrass is the first year is going to look pretty good. The second summer is probably going to thin out. The time to put that down is as soon as you can get on that field. Anytime from starting probably early March. And the advantage of perennial ryegrass and annual ryegrass is when the soil is still moist in the early spring, it can actually be broadcast on top of the ground. It's going to be better if you broadcast it and drag it. But if we're in really wet periods of time that we often have in the spring, then I'd rather see you go ahead and get the seed out there because it will germinate and grow on top of the ground if the soil is staying in a moist condition. Once we're getting now, though, into late March and into early April, then it will be important to drag our light disc, broadcast, and drag again, or use a no-till drill. Once you get past about first week or two of April, then you're probably not going to get a real good catch of any of the cool seasons, even the ryegrasses. So then you're better on those feeding areas to think about some of the warm season annuals. If you want just a good quick cover that'll provide some grazing or even provide a short-term hay cut, then that would be where the spring oats would come in. And again, they're not going to do very well on top of the ground, so they would need to be dragged after seeding, or even better, using a no-till drill, because they're bigger seed. You can go down to an inch deep on those.
All right. Next question, and I'm going to pre-reference this one. This can be cool or warm season, either one. What is the best grass seed to sow on an old strip mine for cattle pastures? Not the best soil in the world in eastern Kentucky.
So probably the best is tall fescue, because it'll handle a range of conditions and it'll handle lower fertility. Um, if it's really poor ground and you're not able to get the pH up, or the other nutrients up, then I would use Kentucky 31 tall fescue. I mean, if you're able to do some applications of lime and fertilizer, then the novel and the fight fescue would give a much better. I mean, you wouldn't have the toxicity. Another good option is the native warm season grasses. We've got some excellent stands of big blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass planted on mine sites, and they're near the quicksand research station. But you're going to have to be patient with the native warm seasons, because they're going to take a year or two to establish. But they will grow on quite low fertility. So and they're also a higher cost seed. So the native warm seasons may be the best, but the seed costs more. You've got to be very patient. Probably the most straightforward would be tall fescue. A lot of those mine sites have Sericea lespedeza planted as well, because it'll grow on pH of 4. But if you can get the pH up, then putting fescue and putting red clover in there every couple of years will give the best combination of quality and production.
Okay. Before I move on to the next question, hey guys, I'm going to post or relaunch a poll. If you all don't care to take a few minutes and fill out this, we greatly appreciate it. It's questions from every night and over the whole program. So I'm going to leave that up. And as we answer the questions, feel free to answer those questions if you don't care. Next question, sir. We've got a young man that is wanting to get into the cash hay business. From a beginner management standpoint, what would you recommend to grow for beginners to sell?
Usually what I tell someone just getting into the business would be orchard grass has a high value, and it's easier to manage a straight grass than to manage a grass legume mixture. So I would make sure the field is ready to plant in September, and I would plant pure orchard grass. If in a year or two you want to add a legume, then it would be easy to add red clover into that in the spring, to have a clover component. So yeah, that would be my answer, Philip, to that. And I would also encourage anyone that's either they're trying a new crop, maybe they're going to try a warm season annual like teff, which is a bit tricky to grow, then to start small. Don't start with a big field. There's actually some growers that were going to get in the hay business in a big way in Western Kentucky. 200 acres they were going to plant alfalfa. They bought expensive Roundup Ready seed. They had some problems. They didn't get it planted, and they've got expensive seed that's getting on the old side, and they're just having all kind of problems. So start small, get your experience up. The other thing with that person just getting started, they might could find some neighbors that will let them cut fescue fields. They're not going to have as high value as the orchard grass, but it's going to be there free for the taking. And fescue cut at a leafy stage can have a good quality, and those toxins in the hay are at much lower levels at the leafy stage. So that would be another way for them to get into it, to get that practice of the timing to cut, making sure that it's good and dry, etc.
Thank you, sir. All right. One warm season grass we did mention is teff. And this person tried it once, but had a problem getting it established. Is that a common problem? And do you recommend teff for hay in Northeast Kentucky?
I've had a few questions already this spring. We did a fair bit of work with teff as a forage. In fact, if you look in that annual grass report, there are several tables that show teff and some summary tables at the end. What we found is that teff needs to be seeded into a seed bed. I mean, in essence, you need to bare soil, and not just bare soil. It needs to. We always say to have. I mentioned in my slide earlier about it being fine and firm. That's important for any forage, but teff is a tiny seed. It's about the size of pepper. So really have that field well tilled and packed. A roller type packer 2 or 3 times over the top before you even plant it. A cultipacker type seeder like a Brillion would be the ideal way to seed it shallow. If you don't have that, then a broadcast and rolling. If you use a no-till drill, you're talking about barely scratching it into the ground, almost just putting it on top and letting the packer wheels pack it in. So if there's an establishment issue, it's usually from being too deep or someone trying to put it into an existing stand. Go on the lower end of the nitrogen rates with teff because it's a nice hay, but it's pretty fine stem, so it can lodge over. If what I did to this grower that asked me the other day, I went to our forage website, went there under species, and we've got 2 or 3 publications on teff, and they give some good overviews about planting and managing and fertilizing. Teff is another one. I wouldn't ever tell someone to say, I'm just, go plan to plant teff every year. The way we've used it at our research station is stands that we were going to redo that were weedy, that were the old Kentucky 31 fescue. We wanted to plant an approved pasture or hayfield. And they were rough and they were bumpy. And so we tilled those fields. We planted teff as a summer hay crop. And since teff is very fine stemmed and doesn't make a dense crown, then after 3 cuttings, then we drilled our new stand just directly into that teff stubble. So it's useful, but you've got to plant it into a tilled seed bed and you've got to plant it shallow, and don't plan for a bumper crop of 5 to 6 tons like some of the advertisements. Think to yourself about 2.5 to 3 tons on a 3 cutting harvest management.
Okay. Guys, I just want to remind you that to fill out the poll, if you don't care, it is completely anonymous, and we're going to take this information and evaluate the program that you all went through this time. One kind of follow-up to teff, Doc. You get it established. Have you had any problems with it pulling up with one of the wheel rakes versus a bar rake? Have you seen anything like that?
I've heard of that. It's very shallow rooted, so you've got to be as gentle as you can on it. Now, typically after the first cutting, it's got a better root system in there. I haven't heard that as a common complaint, but it doesn't surprise me that some aggressive raking would pull it up. I would, I'd rather leave some teff laying there in the field than to be aggressive raking and pull it up. And that's one reason that teff doesn't work as a warm season annual for grazing, because the cattle will pull it up. Crabgrass would be the similar type annual that would handle grazing much better.
Sounds good. Hey guys, if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. A couple house cleaning things. Remind you one more time to fill out the poll. I've got about 45, 46 people now that has filled it out. I greatly appreciate that. If you have not turned in your farm sign name, don't forget you have to make sure you watch them all. And every one of them is recorded. If you need the link to the videos, feel free to email me or your local county agent. We can get those to you. Tonight's session will be posted tomorrow morning. If you haven't got their signs back into me or the sign names back into me, I need everything done by April 1st. That's going to be our hard deadline to get everything in. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, I greatly appreciate the participation. Doc, I was really blown out of the water of the participation we had for this program. We've had average, we're a little low tonight, but we've had on average close to 90 some people on every
Wow.
night. So great turnout, great job by our specialists, including you, Doc. So a round of applause for that. Um, that's about all I've got. If you all have any, if you think of anything after you log off tonight and want an answer to, I know I've got some questions that's been emailed to me that I have not returned back yet, and I do apologize about that. But we will get those questions answered and back to you as quickly as we can. But I'm going to stop the recording here in just a minute. I'm going to pop the poll up here just so I've got an extra copy of it. But guys, you all have a great night. Enjoy this beautiful warm weather and take the opportunity to get some seed in the ground if you need to before Thursday's rain.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
We'll see you, Philip, and all the other agents.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you.
Glad to.
Let's see, I'm going to share the results and I'm going to take some pictures because I'm not the best in the world on this Zoom sometimes.
I'm going to watch you scroll down through the results of the survey.
Oh, they did really good on question number 7. You did a great job, Doc.
Good, good. Okay, I'll leave it with you, Philip.
Thank you, sir. Have a good evening.
Okay.